Unexplained snow camping events that will give you chills. Story number 1, by Ethan Calloway. In January 2019, I planned a solo winter camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. I've always loved winter hiking, the quiet, the stillness, the way the snow transforms the landscape into something otherworldly. This time, I chose Avalanche Lake, a remote spot surrounded by towering cliffs and dense forest. It had always been one of my favorite places to visit in the summer, but I'd never been there in winter. I wanted to experience its solitude and beauty, and maybe even challenge myself. What I didn't expect was to encounter something I still can't explain. The day I arrived was crisp and clear, with the sun casting a golden glow over the snow-covered trees. The hike to the lake was grueling, with snowdrifts slowing my progress and the cold biting at my face. But the scenery made it all worth it. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping low, and the landscape was bathed in hues of pink and orange. I set up my tent at the edge of the frozen water, marveling at the stillness around me. It was so quiet that the only sounds were my own footsteps and the distant groaning of the ice beneath the lake's surface. As night fell, the temperature plummeted. I built a fire and sat beside it, eating my dinner and trying to soak in the peace I'd been craving. But the silence felt different now, heavier, almost oppressive. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to my imagination. After all, I was alone in one of the most isolated parts of the Adirondacks. What could possibly be out there? By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to embers, and the cold seemed to press in from all sides. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the wind as it howled through the trees. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly, heart pounding, unsure of what had startled me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of boots crunching in the snow. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to listen. The steps were slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I told myself it had to be an animal, but deep down, I knew better. No animal walks like that. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. The light illuminated the snow, revealing a single set of footprints leading right up to my tent. My stomach dropped. The footprints were fresh, but there were no tracks leading away. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had made them had simply vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I stepped out of the tent, my breath forming clouds in the freezing air. I swept the flashlight around the campsite, but the snow beyond the footprints was untouched. I followed the trail a few steps back toward the lake, but it stopped abruptly, as if the person had disappeared into thin air. The silence was deafening, and the shadows cast by the moonlight seemed to shift with every movement. I retreated to my tent, locking the zipper, as if that would somehow keep me safe. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear. Every rustle of the wind made me jump, and I clutched my knife tightly, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt alive, watching me. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling, not because of the snow, but because of the constant feeling of being watched. Every crunch of snow beneath my boots felt louder than it should have, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. When I finally reached the ranger station, I told the ranger what had happened. He listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every word. "You're not the first to report that," he said. He told me about Thomas Gentry, a hiker who had gone missing in the 1930s during a snowstorm in that same area. Search parties found his abandoned camp near Avalanche Lake, but no trace of him. just a single trail of footprints leading into the woods that stopped abruptly. "Some people say he's still out there," the ranger added, his voice low. "Wandering, looking for help, or something else." The ranger's words sent a chill down my spine. I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since. The memory of those footprints and the oppressive silence of that night still haunt me. The wilderness may seem empty, but sometimes it holds secrets we're not meant to uncover. When the snow falls, it doesn't just cover the ground, it buries the past, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And whatever was out there that night, it didn't belong in this world. Story number 2, by Megan Holloway. In December 2020, my friends and I decided to camp near Donner Lake in California. We knew the area's grim history, the infamous Donner Party tragedy of the 1840s, where settlers were trapped in the mountains during a brutal winter and resorted to cannibalism to survive. We'd all read the stories, and while they were undeniably chilling, we didn't take them seriously. To us, the lake was just a beautiful spot for a winter camping trip, and we figured the spooky backstory would make for a fun topic around the campfire. We couldn't have been more wrong. The first day of the trip was uneventful. We arrived early in the afternoon, with just enough time to set up camp before the sun dipped below the mountains. The snow was deep, but the views were stunning. The lake was frozen solid, its surface shimmering under the winter sun, and the surrounding forest looked like something out of a postcard. We chose a spot near the edge of the woods, where we had a clear view of the lake, but enough cover to shield us from the wind. As evening fell, we lit a fire and sat around it, laughing and swapping stories. The flames crackled, and the warmth of the fire made the biting cold almost bearable. Everything felt normal, peaceful even, until Alex, one of my friends, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He was staring at something beyond the firelight, toward the tree line. "Do you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight. We all turned to look, but at first we didn't see anything. Then, as our eyes adjusted to the darkness, a figure emerged. It was faint, like a shadow, but it looked like a woman wearing a long, old-fashioned dress. She was standing just beyond the trees, motionless, watching us. "Maybe she's lost," I suggested, though my stomach churned at the sight of her. The figure didn't move. She just stood there, her outline barely visible in the dim light of the fire. After a long moment, Alex called out, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The second he spoke, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. But the way she moved wasn't natural. It was too fast, almost like she dissolved into the darkness. A heavy silence fell over the group, and none of us knew what to say. We grabbed our flashlights and decided to follow her tracks, hoping to convince ourselves it was just another camper. When we reached the tree line, we found footprints in the snow, small and delicate, leading deeper into the forest. We followed them for about 20 yards, our breath fogging in the freezing air. Then the tracks just stopped. There was no sign of her, no indication of where she could have gone. The snow beyond that point was untouched, as if she had vanished into thin air. Uneasy, we returned to the campsite and tried to shake off the experience. "Probably just a trick of the light," Alex said, though he didn't sound convinced. We added more wood to the fire and sat closer together, trying to ignore the nagging sense of dread that had settled over us. But the night was far from over. Around midnight we heard it, faint crying coming from the direction of the lake. At first, it sounded distant, but it grew louder, moving closer to our campsite. It was a woman's voice, soft and mournful, laced with despair. The crying seemed to echo, surrounding us, though we couldn't pinpoint its source. Then, one of the tents began to shake. The zipper rattled violently, as though someone, or something, was trying to get in. We froze, staring at the tent in disbelief. Alex grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam inside. There was nothing there. But when we looked at the snow outside the tent, We found handprints. They were small and delicate, like a woman's hands, and they formed a circle around our entire campsite. At that point, we were too terrified to sleep. We huddled by the fire, jumping at every sound. The crying continued intermittently, sometimes faint, other times so loud it felt like it was coming from right behind us. The cold seemed sharper, more invasive, as if it was seeping into our bones. None of us dared leave the circle of the firelight. When the first light of dawn broke, the crying stopped. We wasted no time packing up our gear, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever had been out there. As we hiked back to our cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, standing at the edge of the woods. Later that day, we stopped at a small diner in town and told our story to the waitress, an older woman named Marla. Her face grew pale as we described the figure, the crying, and the handprints. "You saw her," she said quietly. "That's Abigail Foster." Marla explained that Abigail had been a member of the Donner Party. When her family disappeared during the brutal winter of 1846, she went out into the snow to search for them. She never came back. Her body was never recovered, and ever since, people have reported seeing her spirit near the lake, wandering and crying. "She's lost," Marla said, "and sometimes she tries to bring others with her." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I haven't been back to Donner Lake since, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that shadowy figure, the eerie crying, and those handprints in the snow still haunts me. Some places carry their history in ways we can't explain, and whatever Abigail was searching for that night, I'm just grateful she didn't find us. Story number 3, by Ryan Ellison. In February 2022, my girlfriend Emily and I went winter camping in the Great Smoky Mountains near Clingman's Dome in Tennessee. We both loved the idea of camping in the snow, quiet trails, breathtaking views, and the chance to enjoy the wilderness without the usual crowds. The Smokies in winter are stunning, with snow blanketing the trees and ice crystals glittering on every branch. But what we experienced there turned the beauty of the mountains into something I'll never forget and never revisit. We started our hike early in the morning, making our way up the trail as snow flurries danced around us. The climb was tough in the cold, but the views were worth it. By mid-afternoon, we'd set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was so quiet, you could hear the wind weaving through the trees and the occasional creak of the forest settling under the weight of the snow. That first night, everything seemed normal. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and sat under the stars, enjoying the solitude. But by the second night, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a strange tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. Emily joked that we'd summoned some mountain spirits by being the only ones crazy enough to camp out in the middle of winter. I laughed, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we sat by the fire, the wind began to pick up, and with it came a faint sound, like humming. At first, I thought it was the wind whistling through the trees, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like a melody. It wasn't random or chaotic. It had a rhythm, soft and eerie, almost like a lullaby. Emily noticed it too. "That's weird," she said, tilting her head to listen. "It sounds human." We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but the humming grew louder as the night went on. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the forest. It was unnerving, but we told ourselves it wasn't anything to worry about, and eventually crawled into our tent to get some rest. That's when the footsteps started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind. But soon they grew louder, slow, deliberate steps crunching in the snow, circling our tent. Emily and I froze, staring at each other in the dim light of our lantern. "Who's out there?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no response, just the sound of those steady footsteps moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam outside. The forest was empty. No figures, no movement, nothing but the snow-covered trees swaying in the wind. The footsteps stopped the moment I opened the tent, but the silence that followed was suffocating. It felt like the entire forest was watching us, waiting. The humming started again, louder this time, and impossibly close. Emily clutched my arm. "Ryan, look." She pointed to the snow just outside our tent. There, in a perfect circle around our campsite, were dozens of small footprints, like those of a child. The tracks were fresh, but there were no trails leading to or away from the circle, as if they had simply appeared out of nowhere. We didn't sleep that night. Every sound outside sent a jolt of fear through us. The footsteps and humming continued sporadically, fading in and out, always just far enough away to keep us on edge. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were already packed and ready to leave. As we hiked back to the trailhead, the feeling of being watched didn't leave us. Every so often, Emily would glance over her shoulder, her expression tense. "I swear I keep seeing something," she said. I didn't ask her to elaborate. I didn't want to know. When we reached the ranger station, I decided to mention the strange sounds and footprints to one of the rangers. His reaction was unsettling. He didn't laugh or dismiss us. Instead, his face grew serious. "You're not the first to mention that," he said. "A lot of people have reported hearing strange humming and seeing footprints in that area. Some even say they've seen a child wandering the forest, but when they try to follow, the figure disappears." He went on to tell us about a boy named Caleb who had gone missing near Klingman's Dome in the 1960s. His family had been camping in the area during a snowstorm, and Caleb wandered off into the woods. Despite an extensive search, he was never found. "People think his spirit's still out there," the ranger said. "Some say he's lost. Others say he's not alone." Hearing his story made the memory of that night even more chilling. The humming, the footsteps, the strange circle of footprints. It all made sense in a horrifying way. I haven't been back to the Smokies since, and I don't plan to. Whatever, or whoever, was out there that night wasn't just a figment of our imagination. Some mysteries in the wilderness are better left unsolved, and the forest near Klingman's Dome is one I'll never forget. Story number 4, by Samantha Hayes. Last winter, my friends and I decided to take a camping trip in the Rocky Mountains near Estes Park, Colorado. Growing up in Colorado, we were no strangers to winter camping, but this trip was different. We had chosen an isolated area that few people ventured to during the winter months. It was supposed to be an adventure, a way to disconnect from the world and enjoy the beauty of the snow-covered wilderness. What we found instead left us shaken and questioning everything. The hike to our campsite was tougher than we anticipated. The trail was buried under a foot of snow, and the cold seeped into our bones despite our layers of gear. By the time we reached a clearing near the base of a ridge, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest. We quickly set up camp and started a fire. The warmth was a welcome relief, and as the flames crackled, we began to relax. The quiet of the mountains was peaceful, even serene. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and the forest seemed to grow darker than it should have. We sat around the fire, joking and telling stories, but the laughter felt forced, like we were trying to push away the growing unease that none of us wanted to admit we felt. It was too quiet. Even in winter, you'd expect to hear the occasional snap of a branch or the call of an animal, but there was nothing, just the sound of the fire and our voices. Around 10 p.m., the stillness was broken by a strange sound. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps crunching in the snow. We all froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking through the forest, heading straight toward our camp. Probably just a deer, my friend Adam whispered, though his voice trembled. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate to belong to an animal. "Hello," I called out, my voice cutting through the cold air. There was no response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just beyond the circle of firelight. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone. "Weird," Sarah, another friend, muttered, trying to laugh it off. But none of us could relax after that. As the night wore on, things got stranger. Around midnight, we began to hear faint whispers. They were soft, almost inaudible, but they seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the trees. At first, we thought it might be the wind, but the whispers were too distinct. It sounded like voices, overlapping and urgent, though we couldn't make out the words. "This is ridiculous," Adam said, grabbing his flashlight. "There's no one out here." He shone the beam into the forest, but it only deepened the shadows. Then, we saw it. A figure standing just beyond the light of the fire. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible against the darkness of the forest. We stared in stunned silence as it remained completely still, watching us. "Who's there?" I shouted, but the figure didn't move. Suddenly it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving so quickly it was almost a blur. We didn't sleep that night. The whispers continued, growing louder at times, then fading. Occasionally, we thought we saw movement in the shadows, but every time we shone our flashlights, the forest was empty. By dawn, we were exhausted and terrified. We packed up camp as quickly as we could and hiked back to the trailhead in tense silence, constantly looking over our shoulders. When we reached town, we stopped at a small cafe to warm up. The owner, an older man named George, asked how our trip had been. Hesitantly, I told him about the footsteps, the whispers, and the figure in the forest. His face grew pale. "You were near Black Ridge, weren't you?" he asked. When I nodded, he sighed heavily. "That's where Henry Drake disappeared." Henry Drake had been a miner in the late 1800s, working near the area we'd camped. According to George, he went missing during a snowstorm and was never found. Over the years, campers and hikers in that region have reported seeing a figure in the woods, hearing whispers, or feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. "They say it's Henry," George said, still wandering, trying to find his way home. Hearing George's story made the memory of that night even more chilling. I don't know if it was Henry Drake or something else, but whatever we encountered in the forest wasn't natural. I haven't been back to the Rockies since, and I doubt I ever will. The mountains are beautiful, but they're also unforgiving, and sometimes they hold on to the past in ways we'll never understand. Story number 5. By Nathan Porter. In February 2021, I went winter camping with a group of friends in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The plan was to hike a portion of the Appalachian Trail and set up camp in one of the designated backcountry sites. Winter camping was nothing new to us. We'd been on similar trips before, but this time, something felt different from the start. The hike to the campsite was grueling. The snow was deeper than we expected, and a biting wind made the already challenging trek even harder. By the time we reached our destination, the sun was already setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of pink and orange. Exhausted, we quickly set up our tents and got a fire going. As the light faded, the forest around us seemed to come alive with shadows, but we chalked it up to our tired minds playing tricks on us. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We ate dinner, told stories, and laughed, the warmth of the fire cutting through the cold. But as the night wore on, an unsettling silence fell over the campsite. The wind died down, and even the usual creaks and groans of the forest seemed to stop. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, making every small sound seem amplified. Around midnight, we heard the first noise, a faint whistle coming from deep within the woods. It was a high, mournful sound, like someone trying to call for help. We froze, staring at each other. "Did you hear that?" Sarah, one of my friends, whispered. We all nodded. The whistle came again, this time closer. "Maybe it's another hiker," I suggested, though my stomach churned at the thought. Who would be out here, miles from the nearest road, in the dead of night? Against our better judgment, we grabbed our flashlights and followed the sound. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we ventured deeper into the forest. The whistling grew louder, guiding us toward its source. But then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, and the beam of my flashlight felt too weak to penetrate the surrounding darkness. "Let's head back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. We turned to retrace our steps, but that's when we saw them. Footprints. They were fresh and human, leading off into the woods. The strange thing was, the tracks weren't ours. They were smaller, like those of a child, and they appeared in the snow where we had just walked moments before. "This doesn't make sense," Alex, another friend, muttered. The footprints weren't there when we'd first passed through. We followed the footprints for a few more steps before they abruptly stopped. The snow beyond them was untouched, as if the person who made them had simply vanished. A chill ran down my spine, and I could tell by the looks on my friends' faces that they felt it too. We rushed back to the campsite, our nerves frayed. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the snow. We huddled together, too shaken to speak. Then, just as we began to calm down, the whistling started again. This time, it was coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a pale figure darting between the trees. It was too quick to make out any details, but the sight of it made my blood run cold. The whistling stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. We didn't sleep that night. Every rustle of the wind and crack of a branch set us on edge. By the time dawn broke, we were packed and ready to leave. The hike back to the trailhead felt interminable, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, following us. When we finally reached the parking lot, we told a ranger about what had happened. His reaction was unsettling. "You're not the first to report something like that," he said. He told us about a young boy named Peter who had gone missing in the area during the 1940s. His family had been staying in a cabin nearby, and one night, Peter wandered off into the woods during a snowstorm. Despite a massive search effort, he was never found. "Some say he's still out there," the ranger said, his voice low. "Lost, trying to find his way back." Hearing the story sent chills down my spine. The whistling, the footprints, the fleeting figure in the trees. It all made sense in the worst possible way. I haven't been back to the White Mountains since, and I doubt I ever will. Whatever, or whoever, was out there that night wasn't just a figment of our imagination. Some trails are best left unexplored, especially in the snow, where the past never truly melts away.